The meeting did not happen in a tent or a hall, but on open ground where neither man could claim advantage. A low rise of earth, bare and wind-scoured, stood between the camps. There, under a pale winter sun, two worlds faced one another. Richard did not wear his crown. He wore mail dulled by months of war, his surcoat faded, his body thinner than when he had left Europe. When he dismounted, pain flared up his leg, sharp and insistent. He ignored it. Saladin arrived moments later, calm, composed, his presence steady as stone. He dismounted as well. For a heartbeat, the distance between them seemed heavier than the war itself. They did not bow. They regarded each other as men who understood the cost of pride. Through interpreters, they spoke of access and truce, of pilgrims and borders, of honor carefully wrapped in reason. Richard listened more than he spoke. Saladin's words were measured, neither mocking nor submissive. There was no triumph in him, only endurance. When it was over, no city had changed hands. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's rule. But Christian pilgrims would walk its streets unmolested, and the war would pause, not in victory, but in exhaustion. As Richard rode back toward his camp, the weight of it settled on him fully. He had not taken Jerusalem. History, he knew, would never forget that. The army began to disperse soon after. Some left in bitterness, others in quiet relief. Richard watched them go, each departing banner a reminder of what could not be forced into being. Berengaria stood at the edge of the harbor when the ships were made ready. She had been loyal in her way, patient, distant, unfulfilled. "Will you come back to England now?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said, though the word felt strange on his tongue. She searched his face, perhaps for something that had never truly been offered. "You are more at home in war than in peace." Richard did not deny it. Peace demands a different courage. They parted without tears. The journey home should have been simple. It was not. Richard traveled in disguise through hostile lands, but his name was too heavy to conceal. In late 1192, he was captured by Leopold of Austria, then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. A king reduced to a prize. Prisons stripped away pretense. In stone chambers that smelled of damp and resignation, Richard felt time close around him like a fist. His body weakened, his temper sharpened. Letters came rarely. From Eleanor always, never from England itself. She worked tirelessly, selling lands, extracting gold, bending Europe's will to free her son. Richard waited, pacing, singing softly to himself in the dark, a king sustained by memory and stubbornness. When he was finally released, the world felt altered. England had learned to exist without him. Power had shifted, loyalty had thinned. Richard returned not as a savior, but as a reminder. He spent little time ruling. There were rebellions to crush, old scores to settle. War still called to him, and he answered without hesitation. It was all he knew how to do. In 1199, during a minor siege in France, a bolt struck him. The wound festered, fever followed. This time, will was not enough. Richard lay in a small chamber, the sounds of the camp distant and fading. Eleanor sat beside him, her face composed, her eyes sharp even now. "Did I fail?" he asked suddenly. She looked at him for a long time. "You lived as you chose. That is not the same." "No," she said softly, "but it is not nothing." Richard closed his eyes. Images came unbidden, Acre's walls, Saladin's calm gaze, the road to Jerusalem he had chosen not to take. He wondered in that final quiet whether glory had been worth the solitude it demanded. When he died, there were no trumpets, only the slow realization that the Lionheart was silent. Bards would sing of him, chronicles would argue over him, some would call him a hero, others a failure. Richard himself left no answer. Only the echo of a life lived in pursuit of something just beyond reach. The first arrows fell like rain that had forgotten how to be gentle. They hissed through the morning air and struck shields, flesh, earth, each impact a reminder that Acre was not merely a city, but a wound that refused to close. Richard did not flinch. He rode forward at a measured pace, the white and red of his surcoat already smeared with dust. His gaze fixed on the walls where defenders moved like ants along stone ramparts blackened by fire. "Hold formation," he called, his voice carrying unnaturally far. Men obeyed, not because they were disciplined, but because the certainty in his tone left no room for doubt. The siege of Acre had dragged on for nearly 2 years before Richard arrived, a slow, rotting stalemate that devoured men and hope alike. Kings had come and gone, armies had thinned. Disease stalked the camp as ruthlessly as any enemy blade. Richard surveyed it all with a commander's eye and a butcher's pragmatism. "This ends," he said simply. He ordered the engines moved closer, despite protests. He ordered assaults where others had waited. He punished hesitation. He rewarded courage. Within weeks, the rhythm of the siege changed, driven by Richard's relentless will. At night, he slept little. When he did, his dreams were filled with noise, clashing steel, screams, prayers shouted into chaos. He woke drenched in sweat, his body burning with a fever he refused to name. When Thomas asked if he was ill, Richard laughed. "I have not come this far to die of weakness," he said. Saladin watched from beyond the city, his forces shadowing the crusader camp, probing but never committing fully. Richard sensed him there, a presence like gravity, inescapable, unseen but constant. They fought with messengers as much as swords. Gifts were exchanged, fruit packed in ice, horses of rare breed, a physician sent when Richard fell sick enough that even he could not deny it. Saladin's courtesy unsettled the Crusaders more than open hostility ever could. "Why would he help you?" Thomas asked, incredulous. Richard considered the question while a physician bound his arm. "Because he respects strength," he said, "and because he knows this war will outlive both of us." Acre fell in July 1191. The surrender was bitter, negotiated under a sun that felt too bright for mercy. Richard stood before the defeated garrison, his expression unreadable. Promises were made, deadlines passed, tensions coiled tighter with each day. When the executions came, they were swift and unforgiving. Some called it necessary, others called it monstrous. Richard did not call it anything at all. He watched the aftermath in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes empty of triumph. That night he walked alone among the tents, the cries of the dying echoing faintly behind him. For the first time, doubt slipped beneath his armor, not doubt of his cause, but of himself. "If I stop," he thought, "everything stops with me." The march south began soon after. The Crusader army moved along the coast, Saladin's forces shadowing them inland, striking when opportunity arose, vanishing when pressed. It was a dance of blood and patience. At Arsuf, the dance broke. Saladin attacked with fury, wave after wave crashing against the Crusader lines. Horses screamed, men fell, the air filled with dust and fear. Richard rode at the center, a fixed point amid chaos, shouting orders, dragging men back into formation with the sheer force of his presence. When the moment came, he did not hesitate. Charge! The knights surged forward like a released storm. Steel met steel. The Muslim lines buckled, then broke. Richard pressed the attack mercilessly, driving Saladin's army back with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Victory at Arsuf burned bright and brief. Songs were written before the blood had dried. Richard's reputation swelled into something almost inhuman. The Lionheart, a creature of battle, invincible. He knew better. Each night afterward, his body reminded him of its limits. Wounds ached. Fevers returned. He snapped at Berengaria when she sought him out, her concern only highlighting the distance between them. "You are never here," she said once, her voice quiet but sharp. "I am exactly where I must be," Richard replied. She looked at him then, as if seeing something hollow behind his eyes. She said nothing more. As the army drew closer to Jerusalem, the weight of expectation became unbearable. Men spoke of liberation, of kneeling at the Holy Sepulchre. Priests promised absolution. Richard listened and felt a strange, creeping dread. He knew Jerusalem's walls. He knew the cost. He knew what taking the city would demand, not just in lives, but in the shattering of something irreparable. Saladin sent envoys. Richard sent replies. They spoke through intermediaries, through gifts and veiled words, each measuring the other. Respect grew where hatred should have lived. In a rare moment of stillness, Richard confided in Thomas. "If I take Jerusalem," he said, staring toward the distant hills, I may lose the army that brought me here. If I do not, history will call me a failure." Thomas hesitated. "And what do you call yourself, my lord?" Richard laughed softly. "Tired." Winter closed in, rain turned roads to mud, morale frayed, supplies dwindled. Richard called councils that ended in shouting, alliances cracking under the strain of pride and fear. Then came the moment of decision. Richard stood before his commanders, his face drawn, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. He spoke of reality, of strategy, of survival. He spoke of securing access to holy sites without burning the world to ash. Some listened, others saw only hesitation. The army would not march on Jerusalem. The decision spread through the camp like fire, anger, disbelief, accusations of cowardice. Richard absorbed it all, silent and unyielding. That night, as the wind howled through the tents, a messenger arrived under cover of darkness. Saladin was willing to negotiate. Richard closed his eyes. The path forward was no longer written in blood alone. The boy held the reins too tightly, knuckles white against the leather, as the horse surged beneath him. The ground fell away in a blur of green and brown, the wind clawed at his hair, and somewhere behind him a voice shouted his name, not in warning, but in fury. Richard did not slow. He was 14, already tall, already broad-shouldered, his jaw set with a ferocity that frightened the men who trained him. The hunt had turned reckless, the way it always did when his father watched. Henry II rode hard, relentless even in sport, as if the chase itself were a test of obedience. "Richard," Henry called again. Richard leaned forward and drove his heels in. The horse leapt a low hedge and thundered into the open field beyond. For a heartbeat, Richard felt only triumph, movement, power, the clean simplicity of speed. Then the ground dipped unexpectedly. The horse stumbled. Richard wrenched the reins, barely keeping his seat. He did not fall. That, later, would matter more than anything. Henry II reined in beside him moments later, eyes blazing. "You ride like a madman." Richard met his father's gaze without lowering his own. "I ride like a king." The words hung between them, dangerous and unspoken before this moment. Henry's mouth tightened. He said nothing, but Richard felt it then, the certainty that whatever blood bound them also divided them, that one day one of them would have to break. Eleanor of Aquitaine watched from the edge of the field, her expression unreadable. She saw everything. She always had. Richard was born in 1157 in Oxford, but Aquitaine claimed him more than England ever would. Eleanor raised him among poets and soldiers, teaching him that power was as much theatre as force. From her he learned languages, music, the beauty of words sharpened into weapons. From his father he learned something harsher. Authority was never given, only enforced. By his teens, Richard ruled Aquitaine in name, though rebellion simmered beneath every oath. He crushed revolts with speed and cruelty, earning fear long before respect. His songs spoke of love and honor, his actions spoke of iron. At night alone, he dreamed of battlefields instead of courts. He dreamed of heat and dust, and the sound of steel striking steel. Glory to him was not a concept, it was a hunger. The rebellion against Henry II came not as a single act, but as an accumulation of betrayals, real and imagined. Richard's brothers shifted allegiances like gamblers changing stakes. Eleanor whispered of independence. France offered support, wrapped in smiles. Richard chose war. When father and son finally faced each other across contested land, the air itself felt brittle. Henry looked older than Richard remembered, lines carved deep by suspicion. Richard felt no pity. He felt only the certainty that he would not kneel. The war ended not with reconciliation, but with exhaustion. Henry II died in 1189, bitter and broken, betrayed by those he had loved. Richard did not attend his final moments. He was already thinking of crowns. On a hot July day in 1189, Richard was crowned King of England. The ceremony was grand, the cathedral heavy with incense and expectation. Richard stood tall, the crown resting easily on his head, as if it had always belonged there. He felt nothing. The nobles cheered, the clergy blessed him, the people roared. But Richard's gaze drifted beyond the walls, beyond the city, towards something distant and burning. Jerusalem had fallen 2 years earlier, in 1187. Saladin's banners now flew over the holy city. The news had spread through Christendom like a wound that would not close. Kings spoke of duty, preachers spoke of sin. Richard heard only challenge. He took the cross not as penance, but as promise. "I will go," he said before the assembled court, "not as a pilgrim, but as a king." England became a means, not a home. Richard raised money ruthlessly, selling offices, taxing without mercy. "I would sell London itself," he joked once, "if I could find a buyer." Those who laughed did not know whether to admire or fear him. Berengaria of Navarre became his queen almost as an afterthought, a marriage of alliance, arranged quickly, celebrated briefly. She was young, intelligent, and already distant from him. Richard treated her with courtesy, not affection. He had no patience for intimacy that demanded stillness. When he left England, he did not look back. The journey east was marked by omens and blood. In Sicily, Richard asserted his authority with brutal clarity, hanging men who resisted him, forcing obedience through spectacle. Some whispered that he ruled through terror alone. Richard did not deny it. Power, he believed, was clearest when unambiguous. Along the way, he gathered men who would follow him anywhere. Among them was a young squire named Thomas of Kent, fictional only to history, but real enough in his loyalty. Thomas watched Richard with a mixture of awe and unease, sensing both greatness and ruin in the man he served. "Do you fear him?" another soldier once asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, I fear the world that makes men like him necessary." In 1191, Richard reached the shores of the Holy Land. Acre lay besieged, the air thick with rot and desperation. The Third Crusade had already consumed thousands, yet the city held, stubborn as faith itself. Richard dismounted and surveyed the camp. Sick men groaned in the shade of tattered tents. Priests moved among them, murmuring prayers that sounded like apologies. The banners of Europe fluttered, united in symbol, divided in purpose. This was not the glorious war of his dreams. Word came quickly. Saladin was near. Richard felt a thrill he did not try to hide. He ordered his armor prepared, his standard raised. The Lion of England would announce itself not with speeches, but with steel. As night fell, Thomas helped him fasten his mail. "Do you believe God favors us?" the squire asked quietly. Richard paused. For once, he did not answer immediately. "I believe," he said at last, "that God watches." Beyond the campfires, the darkness stirred. Somewhere in that vastness, Saladin waited, not as a monster, but as a man with his own vision of destiny. As dawn approached, Richard mounted his horse and rode toward Acre, the city's battered walls rising before him. The air smelled of salt and blood. Trumpets sounded, and for the first time since taking the crown, Richard felt truly alive. The gates of war stood open.